I'm Elena Barnard, a professor at the Gordon Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria. I'm based in South Africa, an emerging market, and I do research on emerging markets, often using qualitative methods. Over the years, I've come to realize that qualitative methods in emerging markets often don't work quite as one would expect them to work in other contexts. When I was asked to become the editor of the Handbook of Qualitative Methods in Emerging Markets, I saw this as an opportunity to foreground the experiences of other people who've been grappling with similar issues. The group of authors workshopped ideas to make sure that we cover as diverse a range of topics as possible. Then each chapter starts with a personal reflection of the story, what happened, then linking with the relevant literature, and finally extracting guidelines, showing other scholars what we've done and what we think could be done. As the editor, I of course have an overview of the cross-cutting themes, and 5 themes really stood out for me. The first one is that research is an act in society. This is true no matter where the research is conducted, but in rich countries there are often conventions about how research should be conducted. Both the researcher and the participants know what an informed consent form means, and a participant would sign the form with half reading it. The purpose of research is almost implicit. It doesn't need to be explained. In emerging markets, because so little research is conducted there, participants were often more forthcoming in asking, so what is this about and why does it matter? And expecting really a reciprocal relationship rather than something that could sometimes be quite extractive. I think this is a really big learning that we can take from working in emerging market contexts. Related to this is a second big theme, which is around ethics and doing ethical research. Our processes and our forms come from well-developed, rich, individualistic countries. And very often participants struggle to understand why they need to fill a form if there's not yet a relationship, or other numerous nuances about what would be ethical or unethical to do when, for example, interviewing a person who really is desperately poor and potentially hungry. The book covers various strategies that scholars have used, but my one hope is that we will, from an institutional level, take seriously the need to develop ethics processes that can talk to the challenges not just of developed but also emerging countries. Another theme that emerged was the importance of visual data. This shouldn't be a surprise. We live in a world that is increasingly visual, but in emerging market contexts, participants were sometimes too timid or too traumatized to speak, and researchers found it useful to look at what they could see around them. This is, of course, always true. We live in a world full of visual cues, but the work that authors of this book have done to offer guidelines for scholars about how to appropriately capture and code this, I think is a really big contribution of the book. 2 other themes have to do with how much work it is to do research in emerging markets. The first was about going into the field. It's not easy to travel to emerging markets or to stay there. Very often organizations don't have a website where their information can be easily accessed, and these challenges go into the field. The book fortunately outlines in numerous cases and quite detailed information, the steps that researchers have to take to make sure that they are ready to gather the best possible data in the field. The other one is actually about reading around what happens in the field. Researchers in emerging markets do not have the luxury of remaining strictly within their discipline. Very often the information to solve the challenges, to explain what's going on, was coming from outside of their core discipline. People read in history, anthropology, political science, religious studies, medical research, business research. Really, emerging markets force one to give life to the call for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. Two of the themes struck me because they were absent from the book. The first one was, and this is really relevant for business and management scholars, how few of the projects that people spoke about involved for-profit companies and how they tried to make profit. There was often a social dimension, some explanation of the context, but themes like strategy or innovation were underrepresented. I'm not sure if this is because there's some perceptions that those themes are not present or do not matter in emerging markets, but it really struck me that scholars of business and management certainly might have an opportunity to theorize those topics as well. The other one is about politics. Emerging markets are virtually per definition poor. They're not necessarily very stable. Governments do not necessarily want to have the challenges and complications foregrounded by a scholar, and academic freedom cannot be assumed. A number of scholars who did not participate in the book told me how grateful they were that scholars who weren't living in that context were actually picking up themes that they could not dare to tackle because they might be placing their livelihoods or worse at risk. I think this underlines an important thing. Research on emerging markets is not research for emerging market scholars alone. We need everybody to be involved. If there are scholars who are not part of a country, they can say things and can say things without a fear of self-censorship that we can't necessarily say from our vantage point in emerging markets. I think there's a lot more research to be done. I think the book is really helpful in demystifying some of the challenges that people are facing in the field. And I hope this is the beginning rather than the end of a scholarly conversation.